Hi, everybody. So today's guest is someone who truly understands the power of storytelling through sound. Jon Goehring has been telling stories professionally since college as a radio personality, business owner, and a college professor. He specializes in helping business owners repurpose their content to grow their brand using audio. Whether it's podcasting, voiceover, or radio broadcasting, Jon brings a wealth of experience and insight to the table. He's worked with hundreds of brands, and his deep knowledge of content creation for small businesses is second to none. So if you've ever wondered how to turn your existing content into powerful brand building audio, or you're curious about what it's like to transition from a full-time role into entrepreneurship, then you are in for a treat. Please welcome to the show, Jon Goehring. Hi, Jon.
Paul, what a honor to be here, and thank you for such a wonderful introduction. I really appreciate you having me on, and excited to have a conversation with you
It's a
today.
pleasure. It's really good to have you here. So Jon, tell me I'm really curious. What got you into the radio and podcasting industry initially?
Well, initially it was my college years, which, is when you're supposed to find yourself, right? But that's when I walked into the college radio station and a confused 18-year-old kid actually found a path, a path. Not everything figured out yet. I still don't have everything figured out yet. Who of us does, right? But I found a path forward, and that path was telling stories through sound. And that's what I did working in college radio and then working in professional radio here in Rochester, New York, over the United States, and had a great time, had a great, fun couple of years working in professional radio in that career. And it's fun. I mean, you're getting up early, you're on top of the pulse of the community, you're almost like a mini local celebrity. There's so many reasons why radio is so much fun. You work with some great big personalities. But what I realized is that the radio industry isn't an industry that's thriving by any means. In fact, it's changing, to say the least. It's changing more towards online content, podcasting, and we know the power of all of that. So while terrestrial radio is adapting and changing, those traditional roles aren't as widely available. So that's what got me into what I do now, my own business, which is helping business owners amplify audio, literally and figuratively, for their business and to build their brand through podcasting, helping authors turn their books into audiobooks, and helping what I like to say on my website and in my marketing material, bring your project to life through sound. So that's why I'm passionate about radio and podcasting, and it's been a fun
Yeah,
ride so far.
that's really cool. I think it was interesting what you say about local radio, because certainly here in the UK, not that many years ago, we used to have a lot of really good local radio stations. And in the part of the UK I live in is Cornwall, and we used to have a radio station called Pirate FM, and it was very well loved by the locals. And it would always have a lot of local information on there, local advertising, local events, local personalities, lots of local knowledge. It was really good. I don't know quite how it came about, but I know that they were bought out by a big national broadcasting business a couple of years
Yeah.
ago. And it's just not as good. I really missed the local content because that's why it was so much fun. And the DJs were local people. They lived in Cornwall, so they could relate to what, the local experiences that we're all having. Um, and to me, that was part of the pleasure of listening, because you know that they're actually people of the place where you are. But when it goes national, it's slightly anonymous. And even though the DJs might be quite entertaining, it's just, to me, it just lacks the appeal, because it's just somewhere you don't know where they are, you don't know who they are, they're somewhere else in the world. But when they're local, you can relate to the conversation. So I really miss that. So I think it's great that you're able to do that.
Yeah, unfortunately, I think the quantity over quality concept has set in radio, and same here in the United States, where these big companies are buying out all of these stations, and they're not as concerned with the individual localities of the stations. They're concerned with the whole product and getting their syndicated radio program out to as many stations as possible. And they think that people are still going to listen, and some people do, but local radio does suffer as a result. And that is sad to me. It's really sad to anybody who grew up on local radio, like I did, and many people really love that connection that they had with the host or the DJ, like you mentioned. And now here we are. Things are more syndicated. We have more options than ever before to listen to all sorts of content. I mean, if you're going on a long car ride, Paul, I mean, you could listen to radio, but you also could put on an audiobook or a podcast or your own music through a Spotify playlist. And why listen to radio when there's, 10, 12 minutes of commercials every hour when you don't really need that? And all of that content, much of that content is free and widely accessible. So that's a threat to radio stations and people in that full-time radio role. But then on the other side, it's also an opportunity to businesses who now have a lower barrier of entry to getting their word out there through sound. So it depends on how you want to look at it, but that's why I left full-time radio, as much as I loved that position, and went into now helping businesses amplify their message through sound.
I think you touched on something there that also makes a lot of sense, because the advertising perspective. So again, the local stations, I remember there were quite a few local companies that would be advertising, and they might have a special offer or a special deal at a restaurant or a purchasing scheme, and that was affordable to them. But now it's gone national. Firstly, it's
Yeah.
irrelevant for them to advertise, because they don't have like a big chain. If you're something like McDonald's or Wimpy or one of the huge franchises that's got branches everywhere, then it makes sense to advertise on national radio. But if you've just got like a little independent business who's local, they just can't do that, which is a real tragedy, because certainly here in the UK, a lot of small businesses that are on the high street, they're closing down because there are so many barriers. They've got so many expenses. We've got so much online shopping now. People like hairdressers, you can't buy that online yet. And nail products and beauticians, there are certain things that you have to be physically present for. So they're still going to be
Yeah.
surviving. But all the stores that sell something like electronic goods or artistry products, they're just kind of dwindling because it's all going online. And that's a shame, because they're losing that opportunity to do local advertising, which is really tragic. But it's the way of the world, isn't it?
Yeah, and I think that's why what you do, digital marketing, has blown up, and that's what I teach at a local college here, is a class on advertising and consumer culture. But one thing we talk about is the rise of digital advertising and why it's so powerful now and a no-brainer for people, small businesses like the ones you mentioned. Anything hyper local, digital is totally the way to
Yeah.
go, because you're looking to reach your niche. And there are still some instances, like you mentioned, where radio is a great way to reach a specific niche audience, or a podcast is a great way to reach a niche audience. If, for example, you have a podcast on fishing in one of the Great Lakes here in the United States, that's such a nice hyper niched podcast, and opens up a great opportunity for a sponsor in that very hyper niche. But at the same time, if you got a local business somewhere, advertising on radio just doesn't get you the same bang for your buck as it used to. But that digital advertising now is the key. So it's very interesting how the landscape has shifted. And again, it depends on how you like to look at it. It's either a huge threat or a huge opportunity.
Sure. So would you say it's still a good idea to start a podcast, given what you've been saying?
Well, I think so, because podcasts have now saturated the market. And oftentimes when we think of podcasting, or we think of anything that's saturated the market, we think, well, it's too late. I missed the boat, right? That might be the case when it comes to, I want a website. I'm going to sell stuff online, or I'm going to do affiliate marketing with Amazon. Like, all of these things can still be powerful, but since so many people are doing them, how many websites are there out there? Just putting together a website without any SEO efforts or any way to it's going to do nothing for you, right? You simply have an online portfolio that you pay a domain name for. That's all a website is. So the power of podcasting goes beyond that, though. And that's why, even though there are 4.4 million podcasts out there, less than 10% of those are actively putting out episodes each week. So that brings us down to about 400,000. Okay, so now that presents another opportunity to cut through all that noise out there. The sheer number of podcasts, yes, there's too many, but good, high quality podcasts like this one that we're on right now, Paul, those are rare. And the power of podcasting goes far beyond just the podcast players, like the Spotify, like the fact that we have YouTube channels, like those things. Because again, just having that doesn't guarantee us any reach or certainly any business or clients or even name recognition. But when we use that content, when we have a podcast as a content library, now we are able to kill two birds with one stone, as they say. The three reasons to have a podcast is one, to put it out on that podcast player. You never know who's going to find you when they search whatever term it is, especially if your podcast is hyper focused on a specific industry, like fishing, for example. Search fishing podcast and you're a fishing podcast, you're probably going to show up near the top because there's not many podcasts devoted directly to fishing in the Great Lakes, for example. So if you're hyper focused, instead of just having a podcast on business or faith or any of the other very popular podcasting topics, the more focused, the better, right? But that's the first reason to start a podcast. But then the second reason is the fact that you can repurpose the podcast. And that's why podcasting is so powerful. Even if you only have 10 listeners on Apple Podcasts or Spotify, that's okay, because now you still have a content base that you can repurpose and make into the rest of all of your social media content, all of your website content. And then the third reason to produce a podcast, even though it seems to be a saturated world, is that you now have a podcast, a content library to point people to. So if people have a question, very likely you've recorded a podcast episode about it, and you'll find that saves so much time and looks very professional when somebody comes to you and says, well, what about this particular thing? Paul, you do a lot of webinars, right? What about this for a webinar? Well, if you have a podcast episode about that, you can simply point them to that episode instead of typing out a 2-paragraph long answer. Now you've promoted that podcast to them. Since it's directly addressing their need, they're going to listen or watch that show, and now they're going to know about your podcast and get answers to their questions. So that's the power of podcasting. Yes, you show up in those podcast players, but you also have those two other big things. You have a content library and you have the power of repurposing that content. So I'd say, yeah, absolutely, still start up a podcast. You're not too late.
Another question I'd like to ask you as well, and this was inspired by a question that you asked me earlier on. I think it would be really good to have your definition of what a podcast is, because again, I'm sure people have they think they have an idea of what a podcast is, but even to me, as I'm listening to you today, I'm kind of questioning my own perception of what a podcast is, because I remember, back in the day, I remember my very first Apple iPod. It was like a little white cigarette box that had a big dial on the front and an LCD display. But a podcast back in the day was an MP3 file or some other audio file that you actually physically downloaded via a USB cable or whatever. You download the file onto the device so that you could then take the device and listen to it in the car or in the gym. But that's not how podcasts are now. But I think, so tell me, what's the up-to-date definition of a podcast, just to be clear?
Well, that's funny that you bring that up, because I know the term podcast actually came from the iPod, which was an Apple product, right, back in the early 2000s that came out. And so podcast really, it started as a digital audio file. So we have radio shows that go over the radio airwaves. A podcast is that file, but available on the internet, where you can download it, you can stream it, you could do whatever people do with it. But now a podcast has turned into a broader term. So while that definition still holds, there are now video podcasts. Even though we think of podcasts originally as radio shows, they're now video. They are now even between shorter and longer, whereas a podcast was normally like a radio segment, something between maybe 15 minutes at the least and an hour at the most. Now we have podcasts popping up that are like 2 minutes long, and we can still consider that a podcast, even though it's a little short nugget sized bite. But So podcast, the definition of a podcast definitely depends on the way you want to look at it, because the term has been so broad. I will say I've been caught off guard sometimes when I put together LinkedIn videos and put them out on LinkedIn to inform people about the podcasting industry and all that kind of thing. And they're usually between a minute and 2 minutes. And sometimes people come up to me and they're like, "I love your podcast." And I'm like, "Oh, thank you," because I'm thinking they're talking about my actual podcast. And they're talking about, "Oh, I saw that on LinkedIn the other day," and I think to myself, "Wait, oh, you mean my LinkedIn videos? That's what you're considering my podcast." So people are really now kind of loose with the term podcast, but I would say for my purposes, my definition is a podcast is an online show and a content creation engine that positions you as a business leader or an individual as an expert in something, or you bring on experts in something to share information and ultimately make the world a better place through your content. So that's what I try to define a podcast as, even though people have so many different definitions of it.
No, that's really helpful because, no, as you say, the lines have blurred over the years as things have
Yeah.
technologies change, deliveries change, and a bit like webinars, there's a bit of a loose definition. So,
Yeah.
so to you, what makes a great podcast, and how can you really use it to benefit your business, would you say?
The fundamental thing about podcasting is remember who you're doing the podcast for. And that is the number one mistake that we see podcasters make, is they think the podcast is all about themselves, that people are going to listen to watch Jon Goehring because Jon Goehring is the influencer that they are seeking to be like. I mean, they're listening to my podcast for the sake of listening to me. And that has never happened in history. I mean, we look back at all of the popular TV personalities, radio personalities, and we peel back the layers. We think that they're the personalities, that they're the reasons that they're successful. And that's simply not true. And this goes all the way down to the level of your podcast, too. Anybody listening, that is, not your podcast, Paul. I mean, anybody listening, your podcast is not for you. It's not about you. It's about the audience, and that's the number one mistake that people make. They think, well, if I can just become the most popular show ever, I'll just have people coming to me all the time because I'm the expert, because they want me. Do they want you? No, they want the solution to their problem, which you have positioned yourself as. And if you produce good content, then you are. I mean, for a show like Keeping Up with the Kardashians, which is such a dumb show if you ask me, but people love it, right? So there must be something there. Do people love the Kardashians, or do people love the feeling that they get when they're watching? I don't know what they even watch, but they're watching the Kardashians. It's a feeling. It's the information that you get, and that's the podcasting world in a nutshell. So that's the number one mistake that I see, is people making a podcast all about themselves. And unfortunately, the reality is, a good podcast, it's about the audience, and that makes it a challenge for us because all of us podcasters, I think, are like more ego-centered individuals. Like, I know I love to put my voice out there, and I love the sound of it, and I love, there's an ego here. I know a lot of podcasters are that way, but we want to remember that the only reason any podcast is successful is because it's about the audience in the first place. And again, put yourself in the audience's position. What problem did they have? What information did they need that you are going to provide a solution to? That's a good podcast.
Yeah, no, that makes a lot of sense, John, because I think that it's like giving value first, and giving value, which is and useful knowledge that people can take away and make use of, or take action with. And after they've done that a number of times, they'll start to remember who you are because you've given them some good content. But they're not going to come to the podcast and want to hear who someone is if they've never seen that person before and they're just talking about themselves. It's a big turnoff, but giving the value, and that's what brings them back. So yeah, so well said. I completely agree. That's really good.
Thank you. Yeah.
So if people want to get in touch, because I think you've been very helpful in providing some good content yourself today, but I'm sure there are going to be people that are listening that would like to get in touch with you. What's the best way for them to do that, John?
Well, my website is jonathangoehring.com. We can certainly put that in the description too. And that's where you can hear my samples, because I've really started in voiceover work. That was the main thing, is doing voiceover work for audiobooks, for ads, for producing all sorts of different audio content. But now what I've really been passionate about recently, Paul, kind of like how you're doing the webinars, despite your background in digital marketing and everything, you're really focusing on that. I'm really focusing too on helping people start podcasts for their business and helping them use those podcasts to not only be a podcast, but be an entire content creation engine. So the best way would to be to book a complimentary 30-minute call with me. I would love to have a conversation with you and see if there's any ways that I can help you, at least point you in the right direction when it comes to starting your podcast or leveraging the ability that you have to create content, to put yourself out there and watch your business thrive by becoming an expert in your industry and having that never-ending content stream that a podcast provides. So again, would be happy to talk with anybody. That 30-minute conversation through my calendar link is a great way to get in touch.
Brilliant, John. Thank you very much. And John, if I'd just like to say, I think you have a great voice, because I think, podcasting, people have, I know from books that I've listened to, audiobooks and so forth, part of the, for me, part of the attraction is someone who's got a good voice, and you've got a very good, powerful, clear voice. I like the tone of your voice. So I think that's a big help. So thank you for being here today.
Well, thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. It's a really nice compliment. I love hearing that. I mean, my wife says I talk too much, so I'm glad that somebody likes the sound of my voice, and I totally understand, because I do probably talk too much. But this microphone too helps. This is nice and expensive, and that I think it hides some of the imperfections that are in here.
Well, I kind of think, when we talk I don't think you talk too much. I think it's in the context of who we're talking to, isn't it? It's that person who says that. So whatever.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely. And I think she talks too much. So the feeling is mutual, right?
Well, John, look, it's been an absolute pleasure to have you here today. So thank you very much for your time. Thank you for being here. And I'm sure we're going to stay in touch.
I'm looking forward to it, Paul. Thank you